Coming up on our newscast tonight. South Korean soldiers are busy taking down loudspeakers they set up years ago facing the north. The removal of the propaganda tools is part of efforts to deliver on the agreements from the 2018 Inter-Korean Summit. The U.S. has made some changes to plans of slapping duties on steel and aluminum imports. South Korea is given a permanent exemption from the latest tariff measures. President Jae-in marks Labor Day and reaffirms his administration's commitment to improving labor rights while highlighting the importance of communication as well as social awareness and involvement. News Center begins now. It's 8 p.m. here in Korea, live from our studio in Seoul. This is Arirang News Center. Welcome to our program. I'm Daniel Choi. Seoul begins the first day of May by swiftly carrying out measures to implement the agreements from last week's historic summit. The loudspeakers set up along the DMZ to blast anti-North messages are being taken apart and brought down. Park Ji-won starts us off with the baby steps taken to end hostilities across the border.
South Korea's Defense Ministry has begun dismantling the anti-North Korean regime loudspeakers set up along the demilitarized zone on the inter-Korean border. There are about 40 loudspeakers along the borderline that spans some 250 kilometers, and this was the first speaker dismantled on Tuesday afternoon. The South Korean Defense Ministry said that dismantling all the speakers will take more time considering regional and climatic conditions. This removal is part of efforts to implement the Panmunjom Declaration, in which the two sides agreed to stop all hostile acts from May 1st and to eliminate the means to perform such acts, including broadcasting messages through loudspeakers and distributing leaflets in the areas along the demilitarized zone. And military officials here in Seoul said Tuesday afternoon that North Korea also appears to have begun removing its loudspeakers as a follow-up measure to the agreement. The loudspeakers have a long history of sometimes being removed and sometimes set up again, according to the changing dynamics of inter-Korean relations. South Korea first started broadcasting messages to the north using the loudspeakers along the border in 1963, 55 years ago. In 2004, the broadcasts were suspended and speakers were removed following the June 15th South-North Joint Declaration. But in 2010, the loudspeakers were reinstalled again after a North Korean torpedo sank the South Korean warship Cheonan, and the broadcast resumed in 2015 after 2 South Korean soldiers were wounded by a landmine in the DMZ. The broadcasts were suspended later that year after 2 Korea's agreement. The current loudspeaker broadcast began back in January 2016 in response to North Korea's 4th nuclear test. Despite the moves to dismantle the speakers, South Korea's defense ministry assured the public that the military is maintaining its utmost readiness and preparedness while doing its best to carry out the measures of Friday's historic agreement. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Various countries seem to be under consideration as the backdrop for the maiden Washington-Pyongyang meeting. Most recently, U.S. President Donald Trump did mention the truce village of Panmunjom as a possible venue as well. Once again, we would like to remind you there are many names being tossed and there are no official confirmation on the decision just yet. Kim Yo-sun has the latest.
The truce village of Panmunjom, where the leaders of the 2 Koreas renewed their commitment to establish peace on the Korean peninsula, is being considered as a possible venue for the U.S. North Korea Summit, scheduled for late May or early June. After meeting with his Nigerian counterpart at the White House on Monday, President Trump said the inter-Korean border would be an excellent venue for the summit.
We're looking at various countries, including Singapore. And we are also talking about the possibility of the DMZ, Peace House, Freedom House. And there's something that I thought was intriguing. There's something that I like about it because you're there. You're actually there, where if things work out, there's a great celebration to be had on the site, not in a third-party country.
He also tweeted on Monday that the Peace House or the Freedom House on the inter-Korean border could be a more representative, important, and lasting site than a third-party country. Until late last week, Trump had said potential summit locations had been whittled down to 2 countries, including Singapore. But it looks like President Trump discussed the idea of holding the summit at Panmunjom during his phone talks with South Korean President Moon Jae-in following last week's inter-Korean summit. After their conversation, which Trump hailed as long and good, he also added that things are going well and the time and location of the meeting is being set. If Panmunjom is finalized as a venue for the first ever meeting between the sitting leaders of the U.S. and North Korea, the inter-Korean border, which has long been a symbol of division, would likely become a true symbol of peace. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
It was just 4 days ago since the historic event. The 2018 Inter-Korean Summit has come to an end, but still fresh in our minds and still the hottest topic of discussion. So we invited our presidential office correspondent Hwang Hojun here at the studio to help us keep abreast of all that's been unfolding since the 2 leaders said goodbye or till we meet again. So Hojun, thank you so much for being here with us.
It's great to be here.
Right, President Moon has been receiving an overwhelming amount of attention, as if there hasn't been enough attention being paid to South Korea as it is. And he's continuing his efforts to bring the international community on the same page with regards to dealing with North Korea and bringing a peaceful era to the Korean Peninsula.
That's right, Daniel. So since Friday, President Moon has been contacting for his neighboring leaders around the world. And on Sunday, he made a phone call to U.S. President Donald Trump. And the following day, he called his Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, and Russian President Vladimir Putin.
Right, no leader left behind.
Exactly. A Blue House actually said, though, President Moon will call Chinese President Xi Jinping in a couple days, as he is currently away from his office touring Chinese provinces. Even today, President Moon held a half-an-hour phone call with UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to A, secure a statement of support for the Panmunjom Declaration from either the General Assembly or the Security Council, and B, get the UN involved in the process of verifying that North Korea is committed to denuclearizing and to peace on the peninsula. So Kim Jong-un pledged during the summit that the regime will deactivate its nuclear facilities in the northwestern region in May, even inviting experts and journalists from South Korea and the U.S. to come and see that it's really happening. So consider it as the administration setting up a safety system, inviting the UN to get involved in the process of verifying North Korea actually shutting down its nuclear test sites will be a way to absolutely make sure that Pyongyang is following through its commitment and the Panmunjom Declaration is absolutely implemented.
Right, taking flight is important and difficult, but harder and more important is, of course, landing it smoothly, and we seem to be in mid-flight possibly. Making sure the summit is not just perceived as something of a political stunt, and to remind the world that this is a true start of a reconciliatory process is very important, and a lot of hard work involved. And Hojun, you have been our go-to person throughout the summit, closest thing to a fly on the wall we've had at the venue. So I'm sure, aside from the core topics, there were a lot of interesting things that went behind the scenes. Do enlighten us with some. Perhaps start with President Moon Jae-in's impression of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, who he met for the first time.
Right. So a Blue House key official said that President Moon described his North Korean counterpart as straightforward yet polite. So here in Korea, you know that age and seniority are big factors determining social norms and etiquettes. So when the 2 leaders and their wives were about to get on the elevator to head to the 3rd floor of the Peace House for the welcoming dinner, Kim gestured President Moon to go in the elevator first. And when Ri Sol-ju, Kim's wife, was about to enter, he gently took her hand, making sure South Korea's First Lady Kim Jong-suk could enter first. Now, if you want to talk about the ceremonial tree planting, which was also a significant moment, if you remember, when President Moon and Kim Jong-un shoveled soil over the tree's roots, that soil had been collected from Hallasan Mountain in the south and Paektusan Mountain in the north, both very symbolic mountains representing the two sides. But Paektusan Mountain, as you know, is a volcano and entirely covered in volcanic ash without much soil. So apparently, to get the dirt, North Korean officials had to pull up handfuls of specific grass, a specific type of grass that grows on the high altitude of the mountain, roots and all, and have to literally shake the dirt off from the roots to make that pile of dirt.
Imagine what a full day it must have been for them and everyone who's involved. It seems like it just happened overnight at a flick of the wrist, a snap of the finger, but a lot of work went into it, and the reason why it made such a significant impact is because of the intricate attention to detail, of course. Right. Now, a lot of effort from North Korean side as well, as you mentioned, Hojun. What about the most interesting walk the leaders took in the afternoon in the open scene with no one around them, but just the two of them, of course, unmiked? It was interesting to see how fascinatingly the two broke up a conversation, possibly small talk more than about the heavy subjects. It's definitely, to many of us, a Dear Diary moment, perhaps also for the leaders of both sides as well.
Absolutely, and it's interesting because the walk itself wasn't really short at all. For the reporters from Korea and abroad who witnessed the walk, including myself, the walk practically turned into a one-on-one meeting between the two leaders, and even though we weren't able to hear their conversation, it was quite beautiful. The nature, the sound of the birds chirping, the blue bridge and all. But apparently for President Moon, he was so focused on the dialogue itself. He reportedly said to his staff that he wasn't able to realize how nice it was until he returned to his office and watched the recorded footage. Now, we didn't see this happening on the live stream, but the Blue House official also said President Moon Jae-in prepared and handed over some materials related to his vision for economic cooperation between the two Koreas to Kim. And that includes a booklet and a thumb drive containing a presentational video about the so-called new economic map initiative of the Korean Peninsula, which promotes economic cooperation between Seoul and Pyongyang.
Right, it's very pleasant to note that President Moon Jae-in, dubbed the great negotiator by the Time magazine, but I would like to call him a good communicator.
Right.
He doesn't open with the heavy topics. He doesn't start with his needs or his country's wants, but rather starts gently, as many diplomats would say. You start from bottom up, not the other way around when it comes to approaching these sessions.
Right.
As you mentioned a little bit just now, Hojun, economic cooperation, that's a very important element. They did mention seeking mutual prosperity in the Panmunjom Declaration, but we understand, of course, the main hurdle along the way is the sanctions, the heavy international sanctions placed on North Korea. So how do we work around it? So what do we do from here to take the next step towards perhaps earning the trust of the world and opening the doors to potential projects between the two Koreas?
Well, it's going to take time, and that's one of the reasons why yesterday during his meeting with his top aides, President Moon said to his staff that we should start with preliminary studies and research to find and prioritize actions that can be implemented as soon as possible under the current circumstances. We definitely don't want to break the rule, but that's one of the reasons why President Moon really wanted to focus on the joint study between Pyongyang and Seoul. One of the really interesting things that also happened yesterday when we heard from the key official is that Lee Hee-ho, the former First Lady, wife of the late President Kim Dae-jung, who visited Pyongyang in 2000 for the first ever inter-Korean summit, she sent President Moon a congratulatory telegram and commending his efforts and saying that he should win a Nobel Prize. Now, to that, President Moon said that it should be the U.S. President, Donald Trump, who should win the Nobel Prize instead of him for his support of the inter-Korean summit actually happening. And the only prize that President Moon wants to take home is peace.
Right. Should there come a time when there's mention of the Nobel Peace Prize, it should be split three ways.
Maybe.
Or maybe some other key contributors to the process that were perhaps not getting the spotlight enough. When time progresses, we will find out later in the future.
Exactly, it was a collaborative work.
It was a very strong collaborative work. Nothing could have done with just one prong approach.
Absolutely.
A lot of elements contributed evenly to make this amazing, miraculous summit that no one saw coming this year happened. All right, it looks like we are short of time, Hojun. We could go on all day, but that will be saved for when the cameras are off and when we're perhaps biting into some snacks after late at night tonight.
I'm open to all options.
We'll leave that for after the newscast. We'll appreciate you coming in to provide some very important insights to us, and we look forward to having you again from the Presidential Office of Cheongwade to bring us the interesting tidbits about all that's went on. Thank you, Hojun.
It's my pleasure.
With about a month ahead of Washington-Pyongyang talks, key regional players are rushing to have an input before the historic event unfolds. Foreign ministers of Japan and China are meeting with their counterparts from both sides. Oh Jung-hee outlines what could be the key topics during those sit-downs.
Japanese Prime Minister Taro Kono hurriedly met with his new U.S. counterpart Mike Pompeo in the Jordanian capital of Amman on Monday local time. This to reaffirm maximum pressure on North Korea in order to achieve complete denuclearization, as well as to ensure joint efforts to bring back Japanese citizens abducted by the regime. The meeting was the first between the two top diplomats, coming only 4 days after Pompeo assumed the post of U.S. Secretary of State last Thursday. Diplomatic sources say the meeting was highly desired by the Japanese side and was confirmed only after Kono arrived in Amman. Pompeo was on a four-nation tour through the Middle East.
In Washington's negotiations with Pyongyang, Tokyo doesn't want short-range missiles to be excluded from the ban on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Tokyo also wants to see Pyongyang's real intentions.
Meanwhile, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is also to head over to North Korea on Wednesday at the invitation from his North Korean counterpart. This amid concerns that Beijing could feel left out from formally ending the Korean War and drafting a peace treaty. Last Friday's summit agreement, dubbed the Panmunjom Declaration, stipulates the two Koreas will actively push forward trilateral meetings with the U.S. or quadrilateral meetings with both the U.S. and China to set a permanent peace on the Korean peninsula. And that leaves open the possibility of excluding China from the talks.
The two Koreas and the United States have already formed a trilateral structure and are closely coordinating. So there's no need to bring in China to form a rivalry structure that puts Seoul and Washington at one side and Pyongyang and Beijing at the other.
The expert added China will be most curious about how North Korea could be guaranteed of its sovereign security as it directly coincides with Beijing's own interest. With the situation taking not steps but leaps in terms of denuclearization talks between the two Koreas, as well as between Pyongyang and Washington, China and Japan are in apparent moves to secure their own interests and maintain their influence in the region. Oh Jung-hee, Arirang News.
North Korean senior officials got together for talks in Pyongyang. They touched on various policies needed for economic development, mainly focusing on ways to stimulate growth. Park Hyo-jun shares with us what was discussed.
North Korea has held a meeting of senior party, state, and military officials on Monday to discuss ways to propel its new strategic line of economic growth. According to the North State media Korean Central News Agency on Tuesday, the meeting was led by Vice Chairman of the Central Committee of the ruling Workers' Party, Choi Ryong-hae, and Cabinet Premier Park Bong-ju. KCNA reported that the meeting discussed new policies to carry out the new strategy of focusing on the economy, as well as ways to push for revolutions in the science and education sectors in this third year of the North's five-year economic development plan. Jae-in Park also pointed out major faults in the implementation of state projects and proposed issues that required urgent attention. The meeting comes after North Korea declared last month that it would suspend nuclear tests and close down its nuclear test sites to focus on rebuilding its socialist economy. Experts see it as a strategy to help remove the economic sanctions that have crippled the economy.
One of the biggest hurdles for North Korea's economic development it has been the mounting pressure from economic sanctions because North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Easing economic sanctions on North Korea, which is critical preconditions for the success of the 5-year economic plan of North Korea to be successful, is still very much contingent upon the progress on the front of the nuclear denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula.
And once the regime truly abandons its missile and nuclear programs, the rewards such as the removal of sanctions will be of great value for the North's economic reconstruction. Park Hee-jun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in sent out his May Day message this morning, pledging government's efforts to build a labor-respecting society. The Liberal leader pointed out his administration has been fighting for labor rights since its launch, adding such efforts include raising the minimum wage, reducing the overall working hours, and kickstarting three-way communication between labor, management, and the government. However, he also said government efforts alone cannot resolve chronic problems such as low birth rate, high youth unemployment, and continuing economic polarization. President Moon called for social dialogue, highlighting that protecting the dignity and value of laborers is not and should not be an issue of ideology. To commemorate the day to celebrate workers and promote their rights, the Federation of Korean Trade Unions held the 2018 Labor Day Marathon at Jamsil Olympic Stadium at 9 a.m. local time today. Koreans, along with migrant workers and their families, took part in the event. At 2 p.m., the Korean Confederation of Trade Unions hosted a Labor Day demonstration at Seoul Plaza. Its regional branches are also organizing local rallies, and other labor unions will hold similar events across the country. Just hours before the temporary exemption from America's steel and aluminum import duties were set to expire, the White House announced an extension for key allies. Washington also confirmed Seoul is granted a permanent exemption from steel tariffs. Kim Hae-sung gets us up to speed with the developments.
South Korea has been granted permanent steel tariff exemptions from the United States. This comes after U.S. President Donald Trump authorized modifications to the U.S. steel and aluminum tariff measures. In a statement Monday local time, the White House said it has reached a final agreement with South Korea on steel exports, the outlines of which were previously announced by the two countries' trade ministers. Seoul secured its permanent exemption by agreeing to quotas that will cut its steel exports by about 30% based on its average annual shipments to the U.S. between 2015 and 2017. The exception does not apply to aluminum tariffs. The White House also said it has reached agreements in principle with Argentina, Australia, and Brazil concerning the tariffs, the details of which will be announced shortly. The U.S. is extending negotiations with the European Union, Canada, and Mexico for 30 days, postponing the temporary exemption deadline to June 1st.
As of now, it looks like President Trump has got what he had wanted. A 1-month extension signals negotiations with the EU, Canada, and Mexico are also well underway. Just like South Korea secured its steel tariff exemption while renegotiating the bilateral trade deal, the U.S. is using the same strategy to win concessions from other countries like quotas and preventing steel transshipments from China.
In March, President Trump imposed a 25% tariff on steel imports and a 10% tariff on aluminum, calling it a measure to limit imports and protect its national security, but it granted temporary exemptions to some of its key allies. The prolonged exemptions for Canada and Mexico come as the U.S. is working to renegotiate NAFTA, the free trade agreement between the three countries. Kim Hae-sung, Arirang News.
Turning our attention to two of the nation's biggest conglomerates now. For Samsung and LG, the torch is officially passed on to a new generation for the first time in 3 decades. As there could be direct impact on related businesses and affiliates, this transition puts added pressure on the new leaders to make ethical decisions. Lee Ji-won explains further.
The Fair Trade Commission announced Tuesday that going forward, it'll consider Lee Jae-yong and Shin Dong-bin to be the respective legal heads of Samsung Group and Lotte Group. They are the sons of the two groups' chairman, and recognizing Lee and Shin as leaders in the eyes of the law represents the first leadership change in 30 years. The commission says the decision was made because Samsung chairman Lee Gun-hee has not been involved in the group's business activities since he was hospitalized in May 2014, despite still owning the biggest stake in the group. It said the chairman's son, Lee Jae-in, who is also the vice chairman of Samsung Electronics, has been the one actually making crucial changes and decisions in the management of Samsung's affiliates. The younger Lee currently holds the largest stake of Samsung C&T Corporation at a little over 17%. Samsung C&T is believed to be at the top of the group's corporate governance. For similar reasons, the commission decided to recognize Shin Dong-bin as head of Lotte Group in lieu of his father and the group's founder, chairman Shin Gyuk-ho. The elder Shin had been stripped of his seat on the board of the group's holding firm last year due to his advanced age and inability to perform administrative tasks. The group has since seen major changes to its internal power structure led by Shin Dong-bin. The younger Shin is the CEO and the largest individual investor in Lotte Holdings. He's also the chief of Hotel Lotte, which is at the top of the group's corporate governance outside its holding system. The corporate watchdog's decision is not expected to have a huge impact on the firm's businesses, since the change in leadership does not alter or add to the group's affiliates. But the commission says the two leaders could have a heavier weight on their shoulders, since they are now officially responsible for their firm's decisions. Soon after the announcement, Lotte Group said it welcomed the decision, but Samsung was more reserved. The tech giant said the leadership designation will have little impact on either the firm itself or Lee's actual role. This is viewed as a sign the management of Samsung's affiliates has become more individualistic rather than group-based. Lee Ji-won, Arirang News.
Time to turn to Michelle Bach at the Weather Center for the updates you'll need. Michelle, we have rain in the forecast, quite timely as the blanket of fine dust was just getting too bothersome.
Well, Daniel, ultrafine dust levels are still high in many areas, especially over in the central and the eastern regions. And as precipitation is expected to fall tonight, starting from the south, the air quality will eventually improve to normal levels, but until then, be sure to stay updated with the latest forecast. Now, after midnight, most of the nation will get between 5 and 30 millimeters of rain, while the southern coast and Jeju Island will be drenched with more precipitation until tomorrow. Due to the cloudy skies, hot air will stay circulating above the nation, so the highs tomorrow will be pretty much a repeat of today's. Tomorrow, Seoul will begin at 17 degrees Celsius. Daegu and Gyeonggi begins with 16 and 15 degrees respectively. Now, the daily highs over in Seoul will reach up to 21 degrees, Gwangju 21 as well, Busan cooler at 19 degrees. By the afternoon, rain should dissipate over Jeju Island and the southern regions. After the rain, we will be hit with another sudden cooler conditions until Friday, but warm conditions will return by the weekend and the extended holiday over on Monday, which commemorates the Children's Day here in Korea. I'll leave you with the weather conditions around the world.
That's it from us. As always, thank you for watching.